Hi, are you looking for a SharePoint alternative? Perhaps you've been frustrated with the challenges of migrating file servers to SharePoint? Or maybe you've tried to leverage OneDrive for Business as a file server replacement instead? If so, I have good news. There's a better way, especially if you're looking for a cheaper, simpler alternative to SharePoint that can enable mobile access and collaboration without compromising security. In this video, we'll discuss how you can resolve 4 critical migration challenges of SharePoint using CenterStack. CenterStack has been used by thousands of service providers in over 100 countries to cloud-enable file servers for remote access and collaboration while maintaining their existing NTFS permissions, Active Directory identities, and centralized policy-based administration. This file server DNA, if you will, is combined with remote access and collaboration whether the data remains on-premise, is moved off-site, or maintained in both locations for a hybrid deployment. If you're looking for a more cost-effective alternative to SharePoint, something that is easy to set up and just works, something that maintains your existing NTFS and Active Directory permissions while enabling remote access and collaboration, something that doesn't change the ways that a user works, then keep watching. You're going to love CenterStack. So before we dive into the solution, let's review the challenges. These include higher licensing and infrastructure costs, the complexities of setup, configuration, and use, and of course the challenges of migrating data and its permission or access controls from file servers into SharePoint. Now, the last time I checked, SharePoint was a $3 billion product. So it obviously provides plenty of value with features like index sharing, auditing, and a recently improved mobile experience. Smaller companies generally have a habit of bashing more successful products, but you've got to respect their accomplishments. On the other hand, there are certainly opportunities to improve certain aspects of your SharePoint experience. For example, the cost and complexity of on-premise installation. With CenterStack, you can be up and running in 30 minutes or less and deployed to a single Windows Server machine. You'll save time and infrastructure costs to lower your total cost of ownership. In other words, you can think of CenterStack as a lighter version of SharePoint that is much easier to set up and configure. Of course, you might be thinking, well, what about SharePoint Online? That's not hard to set up, is it? Of course, that's true. I've heard people say that you can get started with SharePoint Online in a matter of minutes. The problem is that it's a manual process to copy over the data and recreate security groups and access permissions. If you're setting up a new environment, that's not a big deal, but in most cases, we're talking about migrating an existing environment where all that work has been accumulated over years. And now you're going to have to find a way to configure permissions for hundreds of folders, perhaps. CenterStack, on the other hand, not only copies the data to the cloud, but it also copies or uses the NTFS permissions and Active Directory identities from your existing servers. This means you can get the collaborative capabilities of SharePoint while maintaining your existing access controls in a matter of minutes. Besides that, with CenterStack, you have the freedom to decide where your data lives. So, as you can see in the screenshot, you have the options to create a team folder, our cloud equivalent to a file share, from a file server or from cloud storage. If you decide to leave the data on your existing file server, we will provide cloud-like access to it using the existing permissions on the file server. In other words, you've just created a private cloud with your file server as a VPN replacement. If, on the other hand, you want to replicate your file server data off-site, CenterStack will copy your NTFS permissions from the file server and keep them synchronized in the cloud. Either way, you get all the collaborative benefits of SharePoint with a great mobile experience without being forced to move your data or go through the pain of reconfiguring security from scratch. Some folks take a less direct approach to SharePoint avoidance by attempting to use OneDrive for Business as a file server replacement so they can take advantage of its free storage. It might not seem like a bad idea, but they then discover that OneDrive for Business has its own scaling, data seeding, and permissions problems when used as a file server replacement. For example, decentralized file ownership and peer-to-peer sharing create scaling challenges. Individual users are responsible for sharing the files and folders they own. It's difficult to centrally manage file sharing. And of course, it's difficult to keep track of who owns which files. And that becomes more difficult as the size of the group increases and users leave or change group membership. Then, of course, there are the data seeding, security, and control challenges. You've got to manually copy the data over, as we mentioned, along with recreating your security permissions. There are issues with synchronization as far as scalability and bandwidth utilization are concerned. OneDrive for Business synchronizes your complete data set to every device, and every change that occurs has to be synchronized to every device as well. So this uses up a lot of bandwidth and storage on the endpoints. Having said that, the reason for these challenges is that OneDrive for Business is designed by Microsoft as a portal to all the files that a business user has access to. It's not designed to serve as a centrally managed and administered file server replacement. That task is left to SharePoint. Microsoft has repeatedly reinforced this strategy for OneDrive for Business. For example, earlier this year, Microsoft rolled out the long-awaited ability to sync OneDrive for Business and SharePoint. Jeff Tepper, Corporate Vice President of OneDrive and SharePoint, reiterated that Microsoft's strategy for OneDrive is to give you anywhere access to your files, personal or business, individual or team. The implication here is that business and team files will be centrally managed with SharePoint, which is why the new sync capabilities were introduced. OneDrive for Business and SharePoint can be powerful tools when used as intended. However, they often don't exactly fit the needs of a small to medium-sized business that wants to migrate their file server to the cloud. Instead of peer-to-peer file sharing with decentralized ownership, CenterStack maintains the Windows centralized administration model, which makes it much easier to manage than a misappropriated implementation of OneDrive for Business. It's also much more bandwidth and storage efficient because of its on-demand or smart synchronization, which only downloads files that are actually in use on endpoints. And last but not least, there's the question of data ownership and protection. With SharePoint Online, you have to move your data into Microsoft's cloud. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a tricky question of trust, circumstance, and the resulting requirements. I've heard MSPs defending the loss of data ownership to large companies by saying things like, well, do you trust Toyota or Johnson & Johnson? It's an interesting point, but not everyone is comfortable keeping their eyes wide shut. With CenterStack, you're not forced to go one way or the other. If you want to maintain ownership and control of your data by keeping it on-premise or in a location of your choosing, you can. And if you prefer to migrate to the cloud, we do that too, while maintaining your existing access controls and identities to minimize migration time and cost. So if you're interested in learning how to use CenterStack as a SharePoint alternative that is easier to deploy, maintains existing file server security and centralized administration, while enabling remote access and collaboration, please visit the link below to learn more and become a CenterStack partner.